And it's BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Welcome to True Crime Talk Radio in the morning on Thursday. And because today is Thursday, you can say hello to the Fox. True Crime Talk Radio is a segment here on Black Box Online Radio where I talk about different subjects within a single episode. And it looks like we have DNA King in the chat here. Howdy, DNA King. How are you doing? And in this episode, I'm going to begin by talking about the Lucifer Effect. I happened to just randomly catch a video on YouTube that was from the channel Artificially Aware, and it was talking about the Lucifer Effect. The Lucifer Effect comes to us from Phillip Zimbardo, who was a psychologist, who is a psychologist, more famous for the Stanford Prison Experiment. But he wrote a book called The Lucifer Effect that really wanted to explore how and why people do evil things, and very specifically, how and why do good people do evil things. And from the get-go, it's going to be talking about not spiritual evil or some type of theological evil, but just cruelty, lack of human empathy. And Phillip Zimbardo even calls these things the negatives. And I just think it's like the lack of remorse, the lack of guilt, the lack of feeling, the negatives. I don't like the phrasing at all, just because when we look at the true crime world, one thing that I had to understand was that people who go on to become serial killers and mass shooters and murderers are not evil in the true crime sense. They're not monsters. They're not demons. They are mentally deranged individuals who are dealing with some type of psychological issue. And we have Scott Bobbitt here. Hey, Scott, how's it going? Fire Pixie is here. Hello, Fire Pixie. Okay, so with the Lucifer Effect, good and evil aside, maybe it's just easier to talk about it that way. Some of the points that were discussed is that would a normal person be driven to commit murder? Could a normal person be driven to commit murder? And you, no matter who you are right now, if the exact conditions were present that would drive you to commit murder, would you do it? Yes, you would. Of course you would. I would. Everybody would. I've never liked this type of thinking. And I also don't think that there's anything profound about it. The first time I was ever faced with these challenge questions, I just thought it was so annoyingly obvious that if the exact conditions were present that would drive someone to commit murder, would they do it? Yes, because if for any reason they did not, then those wouldn't be the exact conditions. It's almost like a loaded question. It's almost like cheating. It's like saying, if you were taking a test or a quiz and you scored a 10 out of 10, would that be 100%? Well, yes, in that example, in that exact example. I mean, it's kind of just column A, column B, and blending them together. And I just have never been a big fan of these things. And I think what's much more important to look at is how and why people do the things they do. Because to the credit of Phillip Zimbardo, he talks about how he wanted to explore this subject with a lack of judgment. In the true crime world, we experience a lot of terrible things. People who are committing murders, people who commit calculated and premeditated murders, who know exactly what they are doing. And what Phillip Zimbardo was proposing was to almost take a step back and use something that he called attributional charity, where instead of just saying, oh, this is bad and this is evil, let's look at the causes that could drive people to commit these types of crimes. But he does admit that there is a barrel, metaphorically speaking, a barrel of apples. You've heard that expression about good apples and bad apples, or a bad apple is at the bottom of the barrel. And what he wanted to say is, before we look at someone and just say that, well, they're a bad person, they went on to commit murder, they're a bad person, let's look at the psychological factors that drove this person to commit. Were they born this way? Was there something in their genetics that made them commit these crimes? Was there something in their brain functioning? Were they abused as children? And in certain cases, you will find examples of people who were not necessarily abused and they didn't necessarily have some type of major brain issue, yet they went on to commit murders. And then in that instance, Phillip Zimbardo would talk about them in the sense that they are indeed the bad apple. And sometimes you have a group of them that are together. Like, say, for example, a serial killer who recruits people and they're all just psychologically demented and so on, like the Boneyard Killers with Leonard Lake and Charles Ng and Cricket. That wouldn't be just bad apples. That's a bad barrel. Sometimes you will find people that have genetic predispositions to kill. And William Kane is here. He says, "Hi, Ned. Hi to you too. Welcome to True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. And if you're listening to this episode, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel." So I do think that there's something very honest, because this is a channel where I just discuss true crime cases with you. I come to you live every Tuesday and Thursday at 10:30 a.m. And I really try to do this in a way where I don't want to glorify or justify any of the actions that are done by the criminals. I really want this to come from a point of trying to understand human behavior. But at the same time, I also said that I don't think this Lucifer effect is very profound. What it sounds like it's talking about is something that was shared in a different video criticizing it. That was actually from the Psych to Go channel. They make these animated psychology videos, and their criticism of the Lucifer effect is, well, these ideas have existed for years. The same way I said that it's kind of a loaded question. If the exact conditions were present that would drive someone to commit murder, would they do it? Well, yes. And that's called the psychology of situations, where people behave differently in certain situations. And Phillip Zimbardo is mostly aware of this, and he talks about how he wants to understand, well, what are the situations that are going to drive people to commit these types of crimes. Craig is here from Australia. Yes, good morning. No, it'd be good evening to you, Craig. Sometimes I get confused about which parts of the globe are spinning in which ways, almost as if we're just like a giant Rubik's Cube as opposed to a sphere. But let's look at that for a second. And I want to go through some very strong examples through this episode of True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, because one clear example is the story of Adam Lanza, who was the Sandy Hook shooter. And by chance, I happened to click on this video from YouTube from the channel Dark. It was just called Dark, D-A-R-K. It's a growing channel. It had about 2,000 subscribers, but I think they're going to explode because it was a very well-made video. And Adam Lanza committed the Sandy Hook shooting, and they wanted to explore the concept of, well, how and why did this person commit the Sandy Hook shooting? Because he was an extremely antisocial individual. He was against the social norm. And, when he committed that crime, one of the weirdest conspiracy theories happened, and that was that people were saying that it was all staged, people such as Alex Jones, because there just was not a lot of evidence that Adam Lanza even existed. He wasn't in the school yearbooks. Most people didn't remember him. But yes, to be clear, I did a whole episode on this one called The Sandy Hook Shooting 10 years later here on Black Box Online Radio. I invite you to listen to it. And that was all about how, yes, he did exist. Then over time, more and more physical evidence came out. And in the video on Adam Lanza from the Dark Channel, they showed just some home movies of him playing Dan's Dance Revolution, the dancing video game. And because he had the ability to hyper focus on things, he was extremely good at it. And he also made a call into a radio show once, just giving his thoughts on life and such. And there's an enormous amount of physical evidence that he was a real person and all of the events of the shooting happened. I don't endorse any of those conspiracy theories. Lacey is here. Good morning, Lacey. But with Adam Lanza, it's quite possible that he had a combination of autism and schizophrenia. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm just going off of what I've understood from the media. They're looking at some of his actions and behaviors. He was very socially withdrawn. When he would go to the barber shop, he wouldn't even talk to the barber. Saw the same barber for years. His mother did all of the talking. He was very reluctant to speak with people, almost like selective mutism. But at the same time, he would speak to certain people. And he called a radio show, and he was talking about how he just thought that civilization put pressure on people. Culture was a bad thing, and that he was just going to just say that all of these elements that surround us are toxic and destructive. And he even told the story of Travis the chimp. Maybe you've heard this one. Travis the chimp was the chimpanzee that was trained to live like a human, and he Travis learned to brush his teeth with an electric toothbrush. He could take his own baths in the bathtub. He could use the remote control to watch TV. He liked watching baseball games. Then one day he turned on his owner, and then his owner called a friend named Charla Nash to come over to help. And Travis severely attacked her, ate her hands off and parts of her face. She needed extensive reconstructive surgery, and Travis was ultimately stabbed and shot to death, stabbed by his owner and shot to death by the police. And Adam Lanza's like, no, if this chimpanzee has been trained to live as a human and he still had this episode, does that not suggest that the pressures of civilization are extremely destructive and they drive people to commit these types of crimes? And he has this whole type of articulate reason about why human beings are bad. And then Adam Lanza openly went on to commit the Sandy Hook shooting. And someone in my position looks at this always from the perspective of, did he actually believe that? Did he actually believe those things? That civilization is bad, that culture is non-existent, and that the way we live is just harmful, so you need to free people from the experience of life by murdering them? Number one, yes, I think so. Number two, is that why he committed the murders? No. No, absolutely not. And this is the whole thing about the Lucifer effect. What would drive people to kill? I believe that Adam Lanza was somebody who decided from a very early age that he wanted to be a murderer. And he had a reason to kill because, as I said, mental illness, neurological issues, problems with his neurotransmitters, inability to socialize. And there is evidence for this. He made an entire spreadsheet of the different mass shooters and mass murderers in America, looking at how and why they committed their crimes. He was part of a forum that talked about mass shootings and mass murders. He used the name Smiggles on the forum, and somebody actually knew him from that forum, and they posted in the comment section on the Dark video that, yeah, I interacted with Adam Lanza a little bit on that forum, and it's a real shame that people would abuse something like that, a community resource like that, because not everybody who is following these stories wants to go on to become a murderer. They are genuinely trying to understand human behavior. And I'm just like, more power to that person. And I can recognize the dangers that, or I can recognize the way that some people would perceive this, that people would just look at a forum like that and say, oh, you're just going to try and create killers. No, some people actually want to understand the situations because it is part of the human learning process. Anthony is here, says, good morning, Ned. It's just past midnight here in Australia. Ah, yes, I'm getting my positions on the globe correct, I hope. And Cat Daddy Steve says, Travis was wrongly dosed by his owner on SSRIs, and that made him crazy. Yeah, I do think I actually remember that Travis took SSRIs, and, you know, like a lot of people have adverse reactions to those things. And the problem with SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, is that when someone is on them and they might not necessarily have the exact medical conditions that require that type of medication, then they start getting very, very bizarre reactions. Not to mention that psychotropic drugs can cause side effects. Have you ever heard of that? Side effects. And it can affect people in some very bizarre ways. As I said before, I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not telling anybody to get off their medication. Listen to your doctors, of course. But we do have causes for concern. But some other issues with Adam Lanza that would point to the fact that he was trying to just plan a murder because of his own antisocial tendencies. I think that that is all the primary motive, and anything about rationalizing it through the destruction of civilization is a cover-up for the fact that he was just not able to process and comprehend human behavior to a point where he could integrate into society. Prior to the Sandy Hook shooting, Adam Lanza murdered his mother, and then he drove to the Sandy Hook Elementary School. And they asked this question on the Dark Channel. What was going through his mind after he murdered his mother and he drove to the school? And of course, I can't tell you. I'm not a psychic. I'm not a clairvoyant. I'm not a medium. But my honest answer is, I think nothing. I think that he was so blank at the time. And maybe I'm just going off of some other sources about what people describe, or talking about feeling nothing before they're going to commit homicide and so on. And even in some of my own experiences, when I did something bad as a kid, and I remember very clearly just being blank and expressionless and just kind of thinking about the steps and events that I was doing. I know I'm breaking the rules, but I'm just kind of doing it anyway and feeling nothing. I think he was probably very blank. But as previously stated, Adam Lanza's mother did a lot for him. She even would talk to him for people because he would not talk to people in certain situations. And they also asked the question on the Dark Channel, did he murder his mother as an act of benevolence? Did he murder his mother as a way to try and save her from any type of media backlash that she would experience after the Sandy Hook shooting? And I'm going to be 100% clear with you. No, I don't think he did it for a good reason. I do not. And they asked a follow-up question. Do you think he did it out of anger? I don't know about anger. I think he did it out of revenge. I don't think he murdered his mother for a good reason. When people commit mass shootings and other types of mass murders, it's very normal for them to murder someone at home. And I think that there was a lot of antisocial issues going on with with Adam Lanza's family. But Anthony has a question about he's asking Cat Daddy Steve, what do you mean by the owner of Travis? Well, Travis was a chimpanzee, and he had an owner who was more or less raising him as a human, who would put him in the car as a human, dress him in human clothes, he would eat at the dinner table. Yes, Travis had an owner, even though he was treated like a family member, that person was still his owner all the same. But with Adam Lanza, I mean, it just reminds me so much of the story of Jake Davison, who was a mass shooter from the United Kingdom called the Plymouth Shooter, and he had an online name, Professor Waffles, and he followed a lot of content that dealt with, let's just say, the dating life. I don't even want to get into that too much. But after the Plymouth shooting, people found, his online history, and they're like, now, did watching these dating videos drive him to commit murder? No, it didn't. He murdered his mother, and then he killed at least 4 other people in the Plymouth shooting. But with Jake Davison, very clearly it was an act of revenge because he believed that his mother was siphoning off his disability benefits because he had autism. So it's a very calculated crime. And with Adam Lanza, I think there was probably a very similar motive. Now, with Jake Davison's story, perhaps that's true. I've never seen anything that actually debunks that his mother was not siphoning off his disability benefits and cheating him out of money. No excuse to murder her. Absolutely not. But that just goes to show that it's not about watching videos. It's not about just, like going down the rabbit hole. It's not even about following true crime cases. Another example, Elliot Rodger, the Isla Vista shooter, wrote an entire manifesto called My Twisted World, where he was stating that he was going to commit this crime, a mass shooting, and he called it his day of retribution. And he was saying it very clearly that he was mad that he did not get the opportunity to have relationships with women. And he wrote all of these reasons as sexual frustration, society conditioned them to favor brutish characteristics of inferior men and not the supreme gentlemen such as himself. My Twisted World, Elliot Rodger, you guys must know that story. And what happens next? What happens next? He murdered his 3 roommates who were male and had no part in the manifesto. They had no relation to the cause. So that goes to show that it is about being angry towards society. It is about the inability to comprehend and manage their emotions. It is about perhaps some type of genetic predisposition to kill, and also some types of antisocial personality issues, particularly psychopathy and sociopathy, other aspects of narcissism. And I mean, with Adam Lanza, I think that he could be a very clear example of an unsavable psychopath. And I'm not necessarily sure if he was a clinical psychopath or not. I can't make that determination. But just the indifference that he showed to human life and just the entire way that he grew up, almost in some type of social isolation. But there's just another example I have to give you. The worst mass killing at a school in American history wasn't even a shooting. It was the Bath School Massacre that happened in the 1920s that was committed by a man named Andrew Kehoe, and he blew up the school with dynamite and explosives. But as far as the way he committed the crime, prior to the explosion, like prior to the murders, he also murdered his wife, Nellie Price Kehoe. And this is a very common set of behaviors that a mass murderer is going to do. They're going to kill someone in the house that they live with, and then they are going to commit the mass shooting. And to me, that shows that these are personal killings. Because the whole concept of the Lucifer effect is, why is somebody doing this? Why is somebody going to be driven to kill? They are angry and they believe that their anger is justified. Oh, so I wish I knew the exact person who said this quote, that when people believe that their anger is justified toward other people, there is no limit to what they will do. And I can tell you one, there's a quote from Virgil: anger carries the mind away. When people believe that they have this type of justifiable reason to be angry at a person or another group of people, they're going to do unimaginable things, unthinkably horrific things. And all of the examples that I've just listed off, Adam Lanza, Jake Davison, Elliot Rodger, Andrew Kehoe, all of these mass murderers fall into that category. And in terms of being deranged and types of deranged thinking, I just think that it relates to having certain overloads of neurotransmitters, not feeling the connections to human empathy and behavior because their brains are processing emotion in a destructive way, which affects their impulses, it affects their judgment, and it also creates these types of thought patterns where they think their behavior is justified. Think about everything that I told you. Adam Lanza is like calling into a radio show saying, the concept of civilization is destructive because it requires people to live in culture, and culture cannot exist because it puts pressure on people to behave in a certain way. He's giving this extremely articulate version about how and why the way we live is bad. So this whole concept of just liberating people from the world by killing them, no, that's not it. He was someone who had homicidal tendencies, and then he reshaped his worldview to fit his homicidal tendencies. Purely my take on the subject. Now we have some things in the chat here. Firstly, Charlie is here. Hello, Charlie. How's it going? Anthony says, thanks. I missed the part at the start of the session about Travis. Travis was a chimpanzee, yes. And Charlie says, have you seen what Peterson says about Columbine? No, I haven't, Charlie, but my take on the Columbine shooters, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, is that I think that Eric Harris, of course, was the leader. That's kind of widely accepted. And somebody like Dylan Klebold was perhaps someone who had dark triad traits, but he was in a vulnerable place, susceptible to manipulations. But with somebody like Eric Harris, I think that he is a clear case of a clinical psychopath or sociopath who was really used to manipulating people in certain ways. He had the telltale signs of someone who would try and create psychopathic manipulations. I was watching this one documentary about Columbine, and somebody's told the story of how they knew Eric Harris and they caught him doing something bad. And this woman tells him, I'm going to call your mother. And he's like, oh, well, I'm sorry. And I won't do it again. And she's like, something about it bothered her. He just didn't seem very sincere. So she says, I'm going to call your mother anyway. And then he just got red in the face and just erupted in anger. When she was able to cut through his manipulation, he exploded. That is definitely a sign of dark triad traits. And Charlie says, the 1920s, wow. You're referring to the Bath School Massacre? I saw a fascinating presentation about it here on YouTube called The Devil Came to Michigan. There are several books that have been written about it, one of which is Day of Days. Yes, and it's about, the worst mass killing at a school in American history. I'm so tempted to say mass shooting, but it wasn't a shooting. It was committed with explosives. All of the same reasons that I've been talking about here. Mentally deranged behavior partnered with, well, let's just say partnered with pure selfishness and a desire to feel excitement. Excitement is connected to dopamine production in the brain, and some people have an overload of dopamine that gets produced. A key function of antipsychotic medication is that it reduces the amount of dopamine production in the brain. And Cat Daddy Steve, you said SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Dopamine's up here, serotonin is down here, and you're supposed to try and balance them. Chemical imbalance, right? The problem is, though, it's easier said than done. The problem is that it's extremely profitable to push that narrative that, oh, yeah, well, you need the antipsychotic medication, you need the antidepressant, you need 3 or 4 other medications. Why? Because somebody, not you, no, not you, not me, somebody will earn a lot of money. So people get over medicated. People get extremely affected in some very, very destructive ways. Like James Holmes, the Aurora, Colorado shooter, came off, he was on a lot of psychotropic medications, and he came down off of them, and then his behavior got worse. And this whole begs the question of, do people not have the ability in their own body to adjust, to self correct? Can certain people get over this type of psychiatric issue by using different means that aren't purely with medication? I mean, and are people over medicated? I think the answer is clearly yes. Now, some people absolutely need their medications to function. And again, I'm not telling anybody to get off their um, whatever's been prescribed to them. But I do have so many causes for concern because, as we've seen time and time again, these discussions come up when it comes to discussing mass shooting and mass murder, all the same. Now, Charlie says there was a series of violent attacks perpetrated by Andrew Kehoe upon the Bath Consolidated Schools in Charter and Bath Township. But yes, that's the Bath School Massacre. And Charlie also says people who commit these crimes have more dopamine or need more dopamine. They need less. They need less. Dopamine is what fuels your own excitement. And this is stuff that's a little bit outside of the true crime world, but I talk about Dr. Helen Fisher a lot, and I've been watching a lot of her videos. She wrote The Anatomy of Love, and she talks about the governing components of brain chemistry: dopamine, serotonin, testosterone, and estrogen. And I think this is very hard to understand because a lot of people are just thinking that, it's kind of like what Charlie says in the comments section. People who commit these crimes have more dopamine. I'm addicted to the internet because of the dopamine hit. Now, just because you're dopamine centered, that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. I'm dopamine centered. If you're dopamine centered, you do things that fuel your own excitement. If you're serotonin centered, you do things that fuel a collective excitement. If you're estrogen centered, you are introspective and thoughtful and kind of looking within, self-reflective. And then if you are testosterone centered, you are assertive. It doesn't mean that you are just only fueled by dopamine. It doesn't mean that you only have estrogen in your system. A man can be estrogen centered. I think that I am estrogen centered. And Dr. Helen Fisher said that Donald Trump, former President Trump, was a testosterone centered male. And people in the comments section are like, what? He doesn't have high testosterone levels. He's so silly. No. Testosterone centered just means that you are assertive. This is a system that is designed to label people's behavior. And by the way, can somebody be estrogen centered and testosterone centered? An example that was brought up by Dr. Helen Fisher was Steve Jobs. He was all about, taking the floor, with his black turtleneck. And when he would give his public speeches, she said he was very assertive, very commanding. His eye movements, mannerisms, body language, posture, all of that is testosterone centered. But at the same time, Steve Jobs was a very thoughtful person and also a very creative person. So yes, you can be high in multiple things. 42 Lehman is here, says Harold Schechter wrote a book on the Bath School Massacre. If anyone is wanting to read up on it, Schechter is a true crime legend. Yeah, I haven't actually read a single book on the Bath School Massacre. I went through them after I watched The Devil Came to Michigan, and they were just talking about the different perspectives that were shared in the different books. And I did a short episode once, but that was actually mostly on the murder of Nellie Price Kehoe, where this would be an example of when the perpetrator murdered a family member. She was killed by her husband, Andrew Kehoe, and he arranged her body in somewhat of a peaceful and ceremonial way. John Douglas likes to get into the stuff way too much. Yeah, I would love to read that book, because the Bath School Massacre shows that someone just has the great desire to kill. Like with these mass shooters, with this whole Lucifer Effect, what drives people to commit these crimes? They want to leave the world, commit suicide, and bring as much destruction as they can with them. Look at some of the examples that I've talked to you about. Number 1, Adam Lanza committed suicide. Number 2, Jake Davison committed suicide. Number 3, Elliot Rodger committed suicide. Number 4, Andrew Kehoe, same story. This is a repetitive pattern of behaviors where people want to be destructive and then they want to take their own life so they are not incorporated in any of the aftermath. You could view it as revenge on society. Elliot Rodger even said it was revenge on society, but really it's just about projecting their own misery into the world. Because what did I say at the beginning? If they believe their anger is justified, then their actions toward other people will have no limits. And the Bath School Massacre should be one of the more intense examples of that. And this whole concept of, well, Phillip Zimbardo is writing the Lucifer Effect, right? And he wants to say, what's going to be driving people to kill if they are not typically behaving this way? Let's say 99% of their life is they're going to just be a law-abiding citizen, maybe even somebody who actually has that type of balanced serotonin dopamine level. What would drive somebody like that to kill? Why does the normally good apple become a bad apple? What situations would that take? And even though I don't have a perfect answer for that, when I was reading the book The Sociopath Next Door by Dr. Martha Stout, it just states that people will do things like that, number 1, when temptation is excessive. If they believe that there's going to be a very, very intense reward, or there's just something that they really want and they think that they can't have, they're going to commit a crime. Now, let's be clear, not all of these crimes are going to be murder. For example, Dr. Phillip Zimbardo is really looking at the Lucifer Effect in the context of the Abu Ghraib prison torture scandal, and that's about torture as opposed to murder. Now, let's look at let's just come back to this for a second, though. Number 1, temptation is excessive. Number 2, maybe they've internalized their rage and they believe it's time to release it. But number 3, how about the lack of consequences, the lack of punishments? And this ties into what the psychology of situations. When the situations are present where they believe that they will not be punished, people will behave in different ways. Like, you do this, I do this. When you think that nobody's watching, maybe you behave a little bit differently. How Charlie's talking about being dopamine centered. I'm a dopamine centered person. The way I know this is I fuel my own excitement to the nth degree. I behave very differently when nobody is looking. When there's nobody home but me, my personality is drastically different. I don't even act like this. It's perhaps, just the most silly, ridiculous stuff you can see. And I'm not going to change. Why? Because as Charlie said, dopamine hits are extremely amazing. Can I just go off on a side note for a second? I used to watch this channel called Oak Leaves and Onions a lot. And the host of that program is anonymous. But she said that when you are an introvert, extroverts do not understand you because they can't comprehend the euphoria. I don't care what you're talking about. I don't care what type of drugs you've done. I don't care if you drank 12 cups of coffee this morning. Nothing matches the euphoria of getting lost in your imagination. Charles Manson would agree. He talked about this very clearly. But yes, those are the reasons why good people, conventionally good people, would go on to commit that crimes, murder, torture, and even worse things. Lack of consequences, the temptation is excessive, they believe that it is justified, and also the lack of consequences is tied to something else in the Lucifer Effect. Responsibility has been taken away from somebody, and Phillip Zimbardo explores this by calling it Deindividuation. Hard word for me to say for some reason. But when responsibility is pushed onto somebody else, then it becomes very difficult to have people justify their virtues. And it's the whole point about how somebody else is going to get blamed for this. And you know that. You will not be punished for this. What will happen? And this goes back to the Milgram experiments when somebody is told to give another person an electric shock. Like the Milgram experiments where when someone is asking someone questions, and they're on the other side of a screen. You can't see the person, but they're told to administer an electric shock if they get the answer wrong. And some people would do it even to the point where they thought that they were killing somebody, but really on the other side of the screen, it's just an actor pretending to freak out. And people would do it, though. When they thought that the person might die from it, they would still administer the electric shocks. And the conclusion was people were thinking that if they were not responsible for this crime, they will take a human life. So it really just goes to show a lot of people are jerks. Ultimate conclusion of this episode: I'd prefer the fox. And Charlie says, does noradrenaline come into the question? Oh, that's not Charlie. That's Anthony, actually. Excuse me, Anthony. Noradrenaline. Is that like norepinephrine and adrenaline? If you have to, as I said, I'm not a medical doctor. If you can give me a little bit more clarity about noradrenaline, I'd love to know. I think adrenaline kicks in a lot once the crime has started. And I was talking about this on Ripper Wednesday yesterday when I did the episode on Portrait of a Killer by Patricia Cornwell. And she's talking about how, why would somebody stab somebody 39 times? One of the pre-Ripper victims was named Martha Tabram, and she was stabbed 39 times. That is overkill. That can definitely be fueled by adrenaline. And even the more intense stabbings, the Snoozy and Furlong murders from 1969, where one victim was stabbed 100 times, another victim 200 times, very excessive overkill. I think, I could be wrong, that was done by adrenaline, possibly drug-induced. But adrenaline would play into there. Oh, Charlie says, it's not Charlie. Anthony says it may be called norepinephrine in the U.S. Oh, yeah, absolutely, norepinephrine. With selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, you have two major serotonin, the two major neurotransmitters that affect the conventional form of happiness are serotonin and norepinephrine. And when people experience clinical depression, it's my understanding in my own unprofessional way that the serotonin and norepinephrine levels are too low. Somebody explained it to me this way. Your brain has to pump these neurotransmitters, and there actually is a microscopic neurological pump that moves the neurons and the axons and the neurotransmitters. And the serotonin and the norepinephrine are almost getting stuck in the pump. Like there is this type of clog where, just like water goes down the drain, and if the drain is clogged, then the water can't go through. Then the serotonin can't go through. Then the norepinephrine can't go through. So yes, I think that ties in very clearly. Fire Pixie says, even though I work in a very friendly and active workplace, it's not until I get home and shut my door and close my blinds that I finally feel like me. I enjoy spending time with me. You get it, Fire Pixie. Now, here's this thing. Let's look at this. That sounds like, you're an introvert, maybe, and maybe you're also, the thoughtful, self-reflective type we talked about. When you have the governing components of brain chemistry, dopamine and serotonin, right? Dopamine-centered, serotonin-centered. One thing that I think is very difficult for serotonin-centered people to understand is a dopamine-centered person is making decisions that fuel their own excitement. And sometimes when I do things around other people, I'm not trying to make them feel anything, even if I'm talking to them. And I'll be engaged in conversation, but again, this is about fueling the way I feel. And it can be very, very dangerous. You can get into trouble with this because you're not paying attention to how others feel. And in some ways it's bad, but that's how being a dopamine-centered personality works. You do things that fuel your own excitement. And someone's like, oh, I'm sure you're just trying to make me laugh. Oh, I'm sure you were just trying to compliment me. No, you weren't even on my radar. How you respond to how I feel is up to you in that specific context. And perhaps I shouldn't have done those things, but I'm only sharing this with you to show how different people think. And serotonin-centered people are not going to be perfect angels or anything like that. They're not all about the greater good. They're not all about this type of collective love. Here's an example. A bully that recruits friends to be other bullies. That's fueling a collective excitement that's done in a bad way or a destructive way, to be clear. Now, Charlie says, what is the name of the show? The one about introverts that wouldn't understand others? I try to study all and understand. Oh, I don't know actually. Charlie, is there anything you want to share about that show? Introverts who don't understand other people? I mean, I would love to know more about that. And Charlie also says, I'm learning about adrenaline and cortisol addiction too. I never knew people could be addicted to those. Well, isn't that like being an adrenaline junkie? I guess the adrenaline junkie isn't supposed to be addicted to adrenaline, but this is somebody who likes extreme sports. They like taking risks. They like skydiving and jet skis and so on. Yeah, okay, addicted, perhaps. Anthony says, I imagine that being a dopamine-centered person would suggest a propensity for addictive behavior. Yes, 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 yes. Like Anthony, when I was younger, I mean, I would just like drink 12 cups of coffee a day. And to this day as an adult, I have problems with self-control and so on. And this is not my personal experience. This comes from the talk show host Howie Mandel, game show host too. Howie Mandel, did Deal or No Deal. And he appeared on the Howard Stern radio show. And he talked about how he just couldn't stop when it came to indulging things. He said if he were to drink alcohol, he has to drink until he passes out. If he would smoke marijuana, he would have to smoke until he was comatose. It's just he can't fight those types of urges. That's what I think you're talking about there, Anthony. Fire Pixie says, I'd rather just watch the humans. I find them fascinating and confusing. Fire Pixie, you see this here? You see this, like the guitars in the background? And you see this fox mug? This is how I live. Now, maybe you're saying you're going to think about a few things. I spend all day, every day, just learning about true crime cases and psychology and human behavior, and I'd rather be here. And this is something that I frequently quote on Black Box Online Radio, and it comes from a show called Coffee with Chris, and then host Chris just said, I used to think that I spent all my time alone because I hated people. I don't hate people. I love people, but I can't be around them because they're so darn nasty to each other. And I was like, I'm not alone. Oh my goodness. The magic of the internet that actually allows people to communicate. So can I come back to something? I was talking to you guys about the Newtown shooting, Sandy Hook and Adam Lanza, and this whole belief that just society is bad and that civilization is destructive. Culture isn't real. It's all an illusion. We just need to free ourselves from this, or he needs to free other people. He needs to take it upon himself to free other people. I remember those conversations back when I was a teenager. Yeah, society sucks. Punk, rock, metal, all that rebellion stuff. I never killed anyone. Most people don't go on to killing anybody. But one person who did was Ted Kaczynski. And this is quoted by Adam Lanza. He openly says that. He openly quotes Ted Kaczynski's Industrial Society and Its Future, and Ted Kaczynski, I think, is almost an identical example of somebody who felt rejected from society. He felt he didn't understand it. He felt he didn't belong in it. So he created this type of ideological way of justifying, murder. And Kaczynski did it in a very covert way when he absolutely did not want to assume any responsibility for it. I don't believe that Kaczynski wanted to be caught or anything like that. He set this thing up where he's going to mail in bombs from a distance just to wreak havoc on people because he couldn't form relationships. Now, Charlie says, I forget the name of the podcast, but it's a podcast you watched about introverts and they would understand others. Oh, it's one that I watched. It's something that I've talked about in the past. I would love to know more about it. And it says, I love being silly with friends, but I get emotionally exhausted performing. Yeah, I feel you there, Charlie. And Fire Pixie says, that's exactly how it feels, performing. Well, again, this comes back to introversion versus extroversion. The introverts, mostly, I think a lot of you who are introverts are going to experience a certain type of euphoria when you are getting lost in your own mind and your own imagination. And some people out there, some of these self-help people are just saying you should never, ever do that. You need to be aware of the present. Anytime you get lost in your imagination, it's bad. And at the very least, what I've accepted is you shouldn't get lost in your imagination to judge other people. Like I heard this thing once that anytime you start thinking in your own mind and you're not paying attention to the external world, you're either putting yourself down or you're telling yourself that you're better than other people. Is that really true? Anytime you get lost in your own imagination, you're either putting yourself down or you're telling yourself that you are better than other people? No, I don't think so. That's called a false dichotomy. Maybe you could even use the term black and white fallacy, but I don't want to misuse the term. It's either this or that. What I think that person was trying to say is don't just judge other people. Don't just start thinking about ways in which you are right and everybody else is wrong. Because look at Adam Lanza, look at Ted Kaczynski. They did this at extreme levels, and quite possibly they both had schizophrenia. Ted Kaczynski was given the provisional diagnosis of schizophrenia, and the person who has talked a lot about Ted Kaczynski and his connections to the Zodiac killer mystery is Mark Hewitt, who is going to be releasing a new book this year called Obsessed. And I do have to cite Mark for one thing. It was because he influenced me in one way when I asked him a direct question, and that was somebody once told me that, excuse me, Elliot Rodger was a smart kid who just slowly fell off the rails and it snowballed into destructive behavior that ultimately led to mass murder. And I was like, now, Mark, what do you think about Ted Kaczynski? Do you think he was someone who slowly fell off the rails and snowballed into destructive behavior, ultimately leading to murder? And Mark said no. He was the one who shared that type of thought process with me. He said, I think from an early age, Ted Kaczynski decided that he wanted to be a killer and be a murderer, and he went into the planning process. Exactly what I told you about Adam Lanza. I do recognize that particular pattern. And Charlie says it's true. People can be cruel and they do it for fun. And then what Phillip Zimbardo was talking about with the Lucifer effect is when you're dealing with individuals firsthand, it's almost impossible to try and psychoanalyze them. Like if someone is being cruel to you, you just want them to stop, right? But if you are like an observer to that situation, your immediate response is blame the cruel person. But also, as a social psychologist like Phillip Zimbardo, he wants to understand how and why the cruel person did the cruel things in the first place. But no, if you're in a problematic situation with someone, think back to the days of schoolyard bullies. Somebody once said this in the comment section on YouTube, the best place to get your info. And he said that if someone is bullying you, do you really need to learn more about them? If somebody is bullying you, do you really need to know their middle name? Do you really need to know their favorite food? Do you really need to know what problems they have? You need to get them to stop first, and then that can be addressed, usually by somebody else if it's a schoolyard bully. And Charlie says, my parents made sure I was performing and making them laugh by the age of 4. I literally remember my role from that age. Well, that is kind of sad, Charlie, that sometimes, though, people do perform, as you say, because of acts of human decency. And what people like Dr. Martha Stout and Dr. Phillip Zimbardo were talking about is if there are these holes in the conscience where people are going to behave in destructive ways if they think that the temptation is excessive, or if they think there are not consequences, or if they think they're just following orders, or if they think that their anger is justified, well, where are those boundaries? And one of the things that keeps people in line is the concept of human decency, social conventions, and people definitely have ways of deviating from that. And you've heard me say this on Black Box Online Radio before. I believe that a lot of people who go on to become bullies have a high sense of social awareness, and they understand the social system, and that's how they operate in it. Me, as a kid growing up, I had no sense of social awareness at all. And I think that probably shows. That's why I just kind of like want to be in the room reading books and watching YouTube videos and digesting and absorbing human behavior. It's so powerful to just like watch a video about adolescence and you're like, oh my gosh, that's where I went wrong. But at the same time, you also want to understand different aspects of human behavior, the stuff about serial killers, murderers, unsolved mysteries, all of that. And New Cokes is here. Hey, welcome, New Cokes. That's Vincent. Vincent is actually running a YouTube channel called New Cokes 2024, and he has a lot of videos out on some independent forensic analysis that he is doing on the Zodiac killer's fingerprints and palm prints, and he's even doing some experiments over there. Vincent, I really appreciate what you said about how you had a newfound respect for forensic technicians. And also at this time, we are approaching the 50-minute mark here on True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, and I would just like to open the floor to any type of true crime discussion. You can put anything you want in the chat, and I will try my best to respond to it. And as always, you can hit the like button and subscribe. And remember that this show is available for free downloads on Spotify and Apple Podcasts under the name Black Box Podcast or Black Box True Crime, hosted by me, Black Box Ned. And YouTube viewers get the chance to chill with the Fox on Spotify. You know who the Fox is too, right? And we have one comment here from Fire Pixie. At one point, I worked with Todd Colep. He's referred to as the Amazon review killer for about a year and a half. I remember thinking that there is more to this person. The Amazon review killer? You don't mean Amazon River killer? Amazon review killer? I'm not familiar with this story, Fire Pixie, but I'm definitely going to have to look into it. 42 Lehman says, I would argue that Ted Kaczynski matured into the idea that indiscriminate murder was okay because it advanced his philosophy, and even that the action was bad, it was for the greater good in his mind. One thing, though, 42 Lehman, one thing that Mark Hewitt and I are in somewhat agreement on about Ted Kaczynski is when you read the Unabomber Manifesto, there's a lot of contradictory information. It's almost like this group is good, but then later on he says that they're bad. People who think like this are good, but later on he says that they're bad. However, the person whom I think Ted Kaczynski genuinely liked was himself. In Industrial Society in Its Future, the Unabomber Manifesto, Kaczynski talks about how it's good to kind of live by yourself in the wilderness. Man will suffer, but he'll do it stoically. Well, who is he talking about? Was he talking about the people of New York City? I don't think so. He's talking about himself. Vincent says, only time I've ever truly regretted getting a criminal record at 21 Cruise, Paul Hull's videos make me want to become a forensic investigator and catch these fucks using law enforcement resources. Oh, I would love to even just be 1/10 of what Paul Hull's has done for not only the Golden State Killer case, but all of his investigative efforts. And it's interesting you say that. You bring up Paul Hull's. He wrote sort of a personal memoir just about his journey as an investigator, which I believe is going to go well beyond the Golden State Killer case. That is one of the books that I want to work into for True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. Charlie says, I remember the Amazon review killer. Please look into it, Ned. Well, I can't resist that now. And this is something also about human behavior and curiosity. Always wanting to just know more about this. Oh, you shared something with me? I want to know what happens. I want to know more. And Fire Pixie says he killed a few people and kept a girl chained up in a Connex box outside in South Carolina. Everything that we have said, destructive behavior, homicidal tendencies, temptation is excessive, lack of the fear of punishment, and believing that his anger is justified. Those are my immediate responses. 42 Lehman says, in Ted Kaczynski's mind, he evolved to his position to believe the extreme ends justified the means. Well, I'm going to have to review some of those things if we can get some more concrete examples, but I do appreciate that, 42 Lehman. Chad K is here, who says, Mark Hewitt should open up to a suspect that is like Ted Kaczynski, but not Ted himself. Chad, I agree completely. I'm really curious to read Mark's new book, Obsessed, and I'll be talking about that on Black Box Online Radio, because I was talking about Paul Hull's and his true crime memoir. Mark Hewitt's book, Obsessed, is also going to be a true crime memoir. New Coke says, yeah, he's cool. Plenty of mistakes, but a very smart guy who was might be the perfect man to be the PR guy for D'Angelo's arrest. Well, New Cokes, that's only because Michelle McNamara passed away. Now, you said PR man, sure, but Michelle McNamara would have just been the absolute perfect person. It's so sad that she didn't live to get to see the rest. New Coke says, I've read Industrial Society and Its Future. It's a pretty whiny book. He makes decent points, but his solution is completely irrational, and clearly he had a very hard time taking accountability for his own life. New Cokes, let's just cut the crap here. All right? 42 Lehman as well. Ted Kaczynski was mad that he didn't have sex. He was also mad that he was psychologically abused and twisted and tormented by the experiments of Dr. Henry Murray that began in the late 1950s. And, just the whole concept of being some type of alienated student. And he already has trouble talking to girls, never able to form a real intimate relationship. I know that that's not the answer to everything. Sorry, Sigmund Freud, it's not, but I think that was a very big influence on why he became the way he was. Now, Fire Pixie says the footage of Caleb being rescued from and chained up is on YouTube. There's a profiler named Pat Brown on YouTube who came here to profile him. She has a video about him as well, and so do a few others. Yeah, I'm going to have to check that out. And, as far as sharing videos about, on YouTube about someone being rescued from a serial killer, when I was watching the presentation from Phillip Zimbardo about the Lucifer Effect, he started off by talking about the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, the torture scandal. And on YouTube, this thing is just up here when he goes through a PowerPoint presentation, and you don't even see him on the screen for the PowerPoint slides. And it's all these photos of naked men just, like completely exposed, uncensored, and just they're in the tortured positions, completely naked, hanging upside down, and so on. And I'm just like, the amount of stuff that gets through the cracks of the YouTube censors is really quite shocking, whereas other stuff gets taken down for such benign reasons. Like say, for example, someone's talking about dating and relationships, but they're a little bit mean about it. They get deplatformed. Other people are just posting photos of naked tortured people. It's fine. It's academic, right? New Coke said, yeah, not having sex is a big factor. Definitely agree for Ted Kaczynski. I don't mean to put down anybody's line of thinking and just try to reduce everything down to one subject. Mark Hewitt and I went into this so much on the Zodiac Killer channel when I did the interview with him, the Zodiac Killer channel's interview with the experts, that has once again now been taken down. Somebody just wrote me 2 days ago, hey, Ned, where's the Zodiac Killer channel? And I said that channel has been taken down, but we talked about the different influences and even Sigmund Freud and during that and its influence on Ted Kaczynski. I wish that stuff was still up because, it was just all right there and I could just direct you guys to 13 Zodiac Killer interviews. But as this episode winds down, True Crime Talk Radio in the Morning will return next Tuesday at 10:30 a.m. And every Friday I do a segment about D.B. Cooper. You can catch that tomorrow. On Mondays, I talk to you guys about the Zodiac Killer. And on Wednesdays, I talk to you about Jack the Ripper. Lots of content here on Black Box Online Radio. I also release reels Monday through Friday on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok under the name Black Box Online Radio. Okay. There's also something I have to address. I have had countless requests to talk about the J-Foy videos on TikTok, even though I've responded to them multiple times. J-Foy might not be making too many videos of his own, but he is doing interviews. People have also sent me the interviews that J-Foy has done to talk about his Zodiac Killer suspect, Richard Hoffman. I also saw that Professor Thomas Henry Horan did a video on Richard Hoffman as a Zodiac Killer suspect. I haven't watched it yet. Is this stuff practical? No. And perhaps I'll have to say something on Zodiac Monday, though, but this guy on TikTok is accusing his grandfather of being the Zodiac Killer. And I just think that it's so much. It's a waste of time, or it's not beneficial. I can't even get my words right because for weeks, people have been sending me requests, and I'm just kind of like, I've made public statements about them. It's just really not getting across. New Coke says Thomas Henry Horan is spiraling a bit lately. Anything more specific you'd like to share? And Charlie says, always great to listen. Again, hit the like button and comment under the vid. It really helps out the channel. Hey, Charlie, amazing. That's all from Charlie right there. And I'm going to say cheers with the fox to you. But yes, I will be talking about J-Foy's videos again, only due to the sheer amount of an impact that he has made. And it's just something that I guess isn't going to go away. But as for now, this episode is going to be coming to an end, and I will see you guys over on Cooper Friday talking all about DB Cooper. Thank you so much to everybody who participated in the live chat. I couldn't do these live streams without you, and really, really, I love what you guys have shared about the psychological experiences that you've had, and talking about mass shooters is something that I used to do very frequently on this channel, but not so much anymore. So reviving some of the old topics. And Fire Pixie says, thanks, Ned. Thank you, Fire Pixie, for sharing that story with me. I'm going to look into it. That will be all for me now. Until next time.